If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them to Colossians chapter 2. It is sobering to think that we have just crossed the halfway point of 2020. It's been a pretty wild ride so far. This next 6 months, if it's anything like the first 6 months, put your seatbelts on. It is definitely going to be interesting. We have a presidential election, all kinds of things that are coming up, and we've just kind of been faced with things that we as a nation, as a country, as a culture, probably are unprecedented. Haven't really been faced in the same way with so many things. And man, it just seems like one thing after another that's challenging the way we view ourselves, the way we view this world. How should we make sense of it from a collective standpoint as a group, but then as an individual standpoint as just individual people? How do we make sense of so many different challenges, so many different things that we've been facing? It's really challenging. I want to look at that this morning, and I want us to think about how we're thinking about these things. And I want to challenge us in one sense to think about, how is the messaging, the influence of the what we're taking in, the world around us, how is that affecting the way we're thinking, the way we're understanding, the way we're perceiving and experiencing these different things? To do that, I want to just kind of open with a couple illustrations that have been prescient, that kind of bring up some of these things from the last couple weeks. The first one is a story that happened 2 weeks ago, which it might as well have been 10 years ago now, but it's a story from NASCAR. It's a story from the sports world. NASCAR has one of their biggest races in Talladega, and there's a race car driver that on the NASCAR circuit named Bubba Wallace, and he's the only black driver currently on the NASCAR circuit. Okay, so when they were getting to Talladega and they got assigned their garages, one of his crew members found in their garage a noose that was hanging, and immediately they brought it to the attention of NASCAR, and they condemned it. And one of the things about what's going on in NASCAR is just a couple weeks ago they banned the Confederate battle flag from any kind of NASCAR sporting events. And so this is kind of seen as maybe a response, racial intimidation of the only black driver in NASCAR in what has traditionally been kind of a white sport, kind of a southern sport. These things aren't new. And so the NASCAR president released this statement. He said, "Last Sunday afternoon, NASCAR was made aware that a noose was found in the garage stall of the 43 team. We are angry and outraged and cannot state strongly enough how seriously we take this heinous act. We have launched an immediate investigation and will do everything we can to identify the person or persons responsible and eliminate them from the sport. As we have stated unequivocally, there is no place for racism in NASCAR, and this act only strengthens our resolve to make the sport open and welcoming to all." Now, one of the things that was alarming about this is that this isn't a secure part of the racetrack, so just general public can't get in there. You have to be a NASCAR insider to even be able to have access to this area. They have obviously millions of dollars, race cars, all that kind of stuff. And so one of the things they do before the NASCAR race is you actually take a lap. And as Bubba Wallace was taking his lap, every other NASCAR driver and their entire pit crews got out and walked alongside in solidarity and said, "We condemn any kind of racism in our sport, and we will not allow one of our drivers to be attacked in this kind of manner." The Justice Department actually assigned 15 FBI agents to investigate this as a possible hate crime. And 2 days after the event, they released their findings. And what they found is that this wasn't a noose, but it was a garage door pull that was hanging from the thing that was tied into a knot for a loop on the end of it. Okay. It was actually, they'd found that it had been hanging there for over a year. And so this wasn't something that was specifically targeting Bubba Wallace, which was good news for Bubba Wallace. But what I want to think about, what I find interesting is that for over a year, teams and race car drivers had been coming in and out of this garage, using this garage, and they'd seen that garage pull, and none of them saw it and made sense that this is a noose that was supposed to be, kind of a racial targeting or a sign of kind of, racial intimidation. And what is it that one of his pit crews, when they saw it, that's what they saw. It saw it and it made sense to them. This is someone who is targeting our driver because he's a black man. And I just wonder if we hadn't had the last month plus of just a constant bombardment of these images and this stirring up of racial enmity, of strife between each other, of the different highlighting of the different disparities, and creating such a climate of suspicion and animus and fear. If when that driver had seen that, if he would have seen something else, if he would have seen something more like what everybody else had seen as they came along the way. And it makes you wonder, how much has that influenced our perspective, what we see and how we experience the world? And maybe a smaller, but what seems like a more prescient example to me is a couple weeks ago I was listening to the radio, and they were doing an interview. It was actually a roundtable discussion of the way here in San Diego, they had some leaders from the African immigrant communities that were discussing the way that they've been experiencing a life in America and this relationship between policing and the black community. And all of these guys were really articulate. It was clear they were really intelligent, but one of them said something that I thought was really interesting. His name was Ahmad Mahmoud, and him and his family immigrated here from Somalia. And at one point he said this, he said, "My mom said it best. When she was living back in Somalia, she didn't have to worry about her brothers or her cousins leaving the house and have to think about their death or them possibly dying, even though they were living during a time when people were senselessly murdered. Every day we leave the house. Every day my brothers leave the house. Every day my dad leaves the house. We have to say we love each other. We have to say this might be our last goodbye." And I thought two things. The first thing I thought was, it really is sad to me that a family in my community here in San Diego is fearful every time they leave their house. Look, the context was police violence. It wasn't, I'm going to get in a car accident or community violence, but it was police violence. And what he was saying was that every day that I leave the house, my brothers leave the house, my dad leaves the house, we look each other in the eyes and we say, "I love you," because this might be the last time we're going to see each other. And to live with such fear and dread and anxiety is really heartbreaking to think about that. But the second thing I thought about is that fear and anxiety bears almost no statistical relationship with the realistic possibility that you are going to be killed by a police officer. And look, there's two parts to this, and the first is this: is that in the United States of America, we keep track of these. Every time a police officer kills somebody, it's something we keep track of, okay? So there's databases that measure all that stuff. And what you find if you look at it is the chance of being killed by a police officer are really, really, really small. You can have a high level of certainty that when you leave your house every day, even no matter what race you are, you can have a high degree of certainty that you're going to return alive and you don't have to worry about a police officer killing you. But if you adjust for if you're not involved in any criminal activity or behavior, the chance of you being killed by a police officer are so infinitesimally statistically small that it is almost not even anything to consider. Now, this is not to say that police violence isn't a problem, okay? To whatever degree police violence is a problem, it needs to be taken serious. It is a threat to our liberty and something that we need to take very serious. But the chances of you being killed by a police officer are actually just really, really small, and it's not something that you need to leave your house every day afraid of. But that's not all they were saying. In fact, he was comparing his mom's experience living in Somalia to living in the United States of America. Now, Somalia does not keep track of how many people are killed by police officers. And the reason Somalia does not keep track is because Somalia is one of the most war-torn, crime-ridden countries in the entire planet. Okay? Somalia is actually, there's an organization called the Global Peace Index. And the Global Peace Index, they keep track of how the relative peacefulness of every nation. You know where Somalia ranks? Dead last. Dead last. 163rd out of 163 nations. They've done this study every year for 12 years. Every year for 12 years, Somalia has been either last or in the bottom 5. Somalia is an incredibly dangerous place to live. I looked up what the State Department's rules were for traveling to Somalia. Here's what it says. Do not travel to Somalia. Due to crime, terrorism, civil unrest, health issues, kidnapping, and piracy. Here's their summary. Violent crimes such as kidnapping and murder is common throughout Somalia. Terrorists continue to plot kidnappings, bombings, and other attacks. They may conduct attacks with little to no warning, targeting airports and seaports, government buildings, hotels, restaurants, shopping areas, as well as government, military, and Western convoys. Methods of attack can include car bombs, suicide bombers, individual attackers, and mortar fire, among others. Here's the advice they give you if you are going to travel to Somalia. Review your personal security plan. Consider consulting with a professional security organization. Get a bodyguard. Avoid sailing near the coast of Somalia and review the live piracy report. Draft a will and designate appropriate insurance beneficiaries. Discuss a plan with loved ones regarding care, custody of children, pets, property, funeral wishes, etc. Be sure to appoint one family member to serve as the point of contact with hostage takers if you are taken hostage or detained. Establish a proof of life protocol with your loved ones so that if you are taken hostage, your loved ones can know specific questions and answers to ask the hostage takers to be sure that you are alive. Leave DNA samples with your medical provider in case it is necessary for your family to access them. if you're gonna go to Somalia, prepare to die. That's the data-driven advice of the US State Department, okay? Somalia is by all ways and objectively far more dangerous than the United States of America. And yet, here is this family who has experienced life in both. They've experienced what it is to live in Somalia, and they've experienced what it is in the United States, and they say, we are more afraid of leaving our house in the United States than we are in Somalia. And look, they are not alone. There are a lot of people. There are a lot of our brothers and sisters in minority communities who have that same sense of fear and dread. Why does that exist? It is at least in part due to the reality that we are constantly bombarded by these ideas and these pictures and these worldviews that say that it is incredibly dangerous for us. These news stories, these politicians, these articles that show all of these problems that we are constantly faced with that at least in some part, whatever the realities are of racism in America, they are definitely in some substantial part fueled by the media, by the influences that we see in and around us. Well, let's just take it out of something that is necessarily ideological or has this kind of political bent to it, and just look at how does influence work when we talk about something clinical, something that we can take out, left, right, Democrat, Republican, black, white out of. And let's look at the way that we have experienced this just recently with this health crisis of the pandemic. If you've been paying attention, you've heard some words come up over and over again. These antiviral drugs or therapies that they've been trying to find ways to help people with the COVID-19. Hydroxychloroquine, dexamethasone, remdesivir. And if you've been paying attention to these different therapies, one of the things you found is that as they study these, you'll hear like, hey, we're actually really excited about this possible malaria drug or this steroid that shows really positive effects on people with COVID-19. And then you wait a couple weeks, and a couple weeks later you hear, no, stop taking that. It's actually really dangerous, and it kills people. And if you keep waiting, you wait another week or two, you find out, actually, we think it works again. It doesn't kill people. And you think, what is going on here? Like literally the smartest brainiacs in the world, scientists, researchers, doctors are studying this thing. The stakes are high. It's life and death, and we can't even figure out if a drug is good for us or bad for us. Like, why is that? In fact, this is not a US thing. That globally, all of the smartest people are working on this. Almost every lab has been laser focused on this question of what can we do to help with this. Well, what you find out if you dig into it a little bit is this stuff is really hard to figure out. And one of the primary reasons this is so hard to figure out is because of something called the placebo effect. Okay, the placebo effect is a well-known psychological phenomenon. Most of us understand what it is. That if you give someone a pill that has no active ingredient in it, it doesn't do anything for your problem. It doesn't help you in any kind of way. But you believe that it will work, you can physiologically start to feel better. Interestingly, if the pill is bigger, you think it works better. Like this is how all of our brains collectively work. Okay? The power of influence is incredibly prominent. And so if you want to find out if a drug works, what you have to do is a double-blind placebo study. And the way a double-blind placebo study works, you have three groups. You have a control group that's sick, but they don't get any treatment. You get a group that gets the placebo, the thing that doesn't work, and you get the group that takes the actual drug that you're trying to test, right? And you administer these treatments, and your actual drug has to be proven to work better than the placebo for it to be acknowledged as a possible therapy, okay? But it's double blind, right? It's not just blind. A blind study is where just the people receiving it, they don't know if they're getting a placebo or if they're getting the real drug. But a double-blind study, the people giving the drug don't know if it's if they're getting a placebo or they're giving the actual drug. And the reason, one of the primary reasons is because if the person doesn't know whether they're getting a placebo or the real drug, but the person giving it does know, they will treat the patient differently. And the patient will pick up on those little cues, and they will make decisions in their mind whether they think it's going to work or not work. whether they have confidence in it or don't have confidence in it. This is how our minds are so finely tuned, adapted to being influenced by our environment around us and by our experiences, by the messages that we get. It's a powerful, powerful thing. The power of suggestion has a tremendous effect on how we experience the world. So much so that these things can have effect on not only psychological things like depression or anxiety, but they've shown where they have things on chronic pain, things like Parkinson's disease, irritable bowel syndrome. If you have a placebo and you think it works, you can show physiological effects of improvement. Okay, well, what if we take this idea and this idea of influence and how we're influenced by the world around us, and we look at our spiritual lives? How are our spiritual lives influenced by our environments, by the things we watch, by the things we ingest, by the things we see, by the conversations that we have? And what you find is the reality is it's inescapable. You are going to be influenced whether you like it or not. In fact, you're going to be influenced whether you know it or not. And the question is not will you be influenced, it's what will you be influenced by. Now this morning, this message is really just a gussied up youth ministry message, okay? I say gussied up because we're gonna go a little further in depth, but if you're in youth ministry, you know this message because you give it all the time. In fact, we talk to junior hires and high schools all the time about being conscious and aware of what kind of influences are you experiencing in your life. But for some reason, around college, we stopped giving this message. We don't give it to adults anymore. As if our minds are fully formed and now we think for ourselves. That couldn't be any further from the truth. The reality is that you, just like junior hires and high schoolers, are influenced by the environment around you. The Apostle Paul certainly thought this was important enough to teach the Colossians. Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to the human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. This morning what I'd like to do is I'd like to break this verse apart and look at some different parts of it. Let me read it again, this time in the New International Version. It's a little bit easier to understand. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ. The Apostle Paul here is contrasting faith and belief in Christ, in God, with different worldly philosophies that are based on human traditions and the elemental spirits of this world. Now, Paul is writing this letter to the church at Colossae. Colossae is in modern-day Turkey. It's in the ancient Near East, and it laid along some trade routes. And during this time in human history, they were experiencing this collision of different world ideas, a different viewpoint. So the Apostle Paul started this church there, was ministering to them, building them up. People were becoming Christians. They were thinking like Christians. But he observed, as time went on, as they encountered these different philosophies, these different worldviews, they began to be led astray by them and go after these different ideas. Some of the ideas at the time were Gnosticism, Greek philosophy like Plato and Aristotle, polytheism, the Roman gods and the Greek gods, Jewish mysticism, this kind of Kabbalah idea of the way that God works and all these different mysteries. And he saw this influence, and he saw them leading them away from the simplicity of Christ into a convoluted way of thinking. Well, if we bring this into the modern times, you could say we live at the intersection of ideas too. We live in an increasingly globalized world. We live in a place where we're increasingly exposed to different worldviews all the time. Every time, in fact, you open your phone or you turn on the TV or you have a conversation with somebody, it's likely that you are being presented with different worldviews, different ideas, different philosophies. And as we do that, we begin to whether we know it or not, we begin to be influenced by these ideas. They begin to influence the way that we see the world, the way that we think about things. There's a Barna study from 2017 that found that of Christians, and they define Christians as anyone who reported that my faith in God is central to my life and I regularly attend church. So these are Christians who, not just like, I kind of am a Christian. These are like people who are like, I'm very serious Christian. And said that only 17% of them have a biblical worldview. Only 17% of them, the way that they view the world is consistent with a biblical ethic. And they went on to study the way that these people were influenced by New Age beliefs and postmodernism and Marxism and secularism, these kind of pagan, anti-Christ worldviews. And what they found is these people were strongly influenced by them. And so if you ask these people, are you an atheist? No. Are you a communist? No. Are you a Buddhist? No. But if you evaluate the way they actually thought about the world, they lined up better with these worldviews than they did with Christianity. And look, God is making it clear here that there are two dominant views of the world. There is his view of the world that has him on the throne, seated as the one true authority, the God of the universe, and then there are all the other ones. And that they are antithetically opposed to each other. And look, as you dig deep, as you try to really understand what is it that undergirds this belief or this view, what you'll find is that as you dig deep, you'll find either Christ or you find some other philosophy, some other worldview. It says that this philosophy, this deceit that people are being led captive by, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world. Now, I want to talk about this idea of the way the Bible uses the word world for a second. It can be complicated because the Bible uses the word world in 5 different ways. One, it uses it to describe just the earth, the physical earth, right? So God created the world. That means he created the earth. But then you have the way that Jesus uses it in John 3:16. For God so loved the world. Doesn't mean the earth, he means the people in it. Then we talk about the world that is this world that is passing away and the next world to come. Kind of this contrast. That's the third and fourth ways of using of the where we're at now and what we can expect in the future. But the fifth way is the way that's commonly used in the New Testament, which is to describe various wicked, rebellious attitudes, people, and systems that oppose God and his rule. That is the way that the Apostle Paul is using the word world here. He's saying that these human traditions, these philosophies are based not on Christ, but on the world. Jesus used the word world like that in John 17. He says, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world. Say, of the world. He's contrasting this idea here of in the world, but not of the world. Okay? He says, even as I am not of the world, I do not ask you to take them out of the world, but to keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I also have sent them into the world. And he's laying out this present dichotomy we find ourselves, this trouble we find ourselves, that God has not called us to go be outside of the world. Okay? He doesn't want Foothills to come together, pool our resources, and buy a big ranch in Idaho, and all move up there and just hang out with each other all day long and be Christians together. In fact, he wants us to live in the world. He wants us to live around other pagans, around other non-Christians. He wants us to have pagan neighbors and pagan co-workers. He wants us to be in the world. But he does not want us to be of the world. He does not want our thinking, our actions, our behavior, our state of being to be like the world. He wants to be distinctly Christian. God desires that we would influence them without being influenced by them. It says in James 1:27, pure and undefiled religion is this. The last part of the verse says, to keep oneself unstained by the world. He wants us to live in such a way that we are not being polluted or stained by the world. This requires a total way of being and thinking. It requires us to think like Christians. Listen, there are no neutral ideas. This is really important because today we believe in this kind of myth of neutrality. A lot of people think there are certain things that are Christian, but there's lots of other things that are not Christian that don't necessarily don't have a direct a relationship with my belief and faith in Christ. That is a myth. That is not true. Like I said earlier, every single idea, every single concept, every single thing that we experience, if you dig down into it, you will find at bedrock a presupposition that is either godly or is not godly, is either Christian, distinctly Christian, or is not Christian. In the simplest terms, Jesus put it about as simple as you can. He said in Matthew 12:30, he who is not with me is against me. If you are either with me or against me. There is no middle ground. There is no neutrality you can look for. Okay, if that's true, if there's no middle ground, if we're either for him or against him, then how do we make sense of this idea that there are so many Christians out there that do not think at all like Christians? Well, let's go back to Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. See to it that no one takes you captive. Say, takes you captive. by philosophy and empty deceit. These philosophies, ideas, arguments, perspectives, worldviews out there, which are rooted in human tradition and spiritual forces, that if you're not careful, he says something very interesting. He says he uses the words, they will take you captive. This word taken captive is like being kidnapped. It means led away as prey. There is a danger that you can be deceived and led away from the true, simple message of the gospel. In the Bible, Satan is called an angel of light. He masquerades around. You know, so often when we think about sin, we think about evil, we think of like, I'm gonna get you. I'm a bad guy. I twist my mustache. I wear dark clothes. I ride a motorcycle, right? We think about like these really obvious, obtuse, very direct kinds of sin, very direct kinds of temptation. But here it says that they're seductive, that they're sneaky, they're deceptive, that it can look good. In fact, it says in Proverbs 14:12, there is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. What this means is there are things that you will encounter in this world that you'll think, that's smart, that's a good idea, that makes sense to me. It seems right to a man. But it says here that its end is death. Look, we can see all kinds of various philosophies that are out there that fit this bill. I'm just going to give you an example of one that is prominent right now. The example of socialism as a more equitable economic means to help people that are impoverished. It really has its roots in Karl Marx around the mid part of the 19th century. And Marx's idea was basically, he looked out at the world, he saw such great inequality. He saw the people who were the bourgeois class, the rich people that had everything. He saw the masses that were poor and disenfranchised. And he said, this is wrong. There's so much pain and suffering that comes to the poor and the disenfranchised that this small population should not be living the high life. And so he said, what we need to do is we need to take the means of production, we need to take the institutions, the organizations, the various corporations, and we need to take them away from the rich people and give them to the poor people, the government, so that we can have a more equitable society. Look, this is not some idea from 200 years ago that we're talking about. This is an idea that is prevalent right now today. We just had Bernie Sanders, who is the runner-up for the Democratic nominee, he says he's a socialist. A democratic socialist. Not only that, in these conversations we're having that center around healthcare and race and economics, there is a ton of socialism, of Marxism that's being pushed on us. And as you look, what you'll find is people say, look, if you care about poor people, if you care about disenfranchised people, if you care about marginalized people, then you should embrace Marxism. And it's such a myopic view of even the most recent history. Marxism is the root fundamental idea that over the last 100 years, from 1920 to 2020, has been directly responsible for the death of over 100 million people. You look at the histories of Russia, of Southeast Asia, of Cambodia, of China, of Eastern Europe, of Cuba, right now, today in Venezuela, you find an incredible amount of suffering, an incredible amount of death because of this philosophical worldview. Now, let me ask you this question. Of those over 100 million people who have suffered and died, how many of them were poor and marginalized? The vast majority of them. So if we actually care about poor, marginalized people, we would run the opposite direction of Marxism. But it's an idea that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Let's go back to this Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. I just want to look at the very first part of this verse. See to it. Say, see to it. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit. Where does the Apostle Paul put the locution of responsibility on to make sure you're not led captive? On you. See to it. Make sure that you are not led captive. You are the one who is responsible to make sure that you are not led away by these other worldly philosophies, these things that are anti-Christ. So many people fail this because they just unquestionably absorb the things that are out there. I'm just reading. I'm just listening. This is like such a junior high message. Hey, you shouldn't listen to that song. Oh, I don't listen to the lyrics. I just like the music. Yeah, right, idiot. you know? But like, Christians do this stuff all the time. Christians just, I don't particularly want you to come examine my, my Netflix history or something, right? Like, I'm not sure I want to give you an account for everything that I watch and listen to. Do you want me to come and investigate that in your life? Many of us, we don't, because we're not totally sure what you would find. And our argument for it might often be something like, I don't listen to the lyrics, I just like the music, you know? It's got a great storyline. Because somehow we don't actually deeply evaluate any of these things in any meaningful way. Sometimes where Christians they're just unprepared for these arguments because we have like a certain amount of like preparedness and diligence when we get these like overt temptations or overt sins, right? Steal, lying, murder. We kind of are prepared for some of those things, but some of the more subtle ideas we're unprepared to fight against. There's this idea that's been in the news over the last few years about symmetrical warfare versus asymmetrical warfare. And it's this idea about the U.S. Army and the way that we prepare to fight wars. And so symmetrical warfare is when two forces of somewhat comparable strength fighting against each other. This would be like on the Western Front during World War II when we were fighting with Germany. We have tanks, they have tanks. We have airplanes, they have airplanes. Or in the Pacific Theater with the Japanese, they have aircraft carriers, we have aircraft carriers. They have destroyers, we have destroyers. But what happens when you go to like the Pashtun region of Afghanistan? They don't have any helicopters, they don't have any planes, they don't have any missiles. But they have a whole different set of strategies, right? They have IEDs, they have terrorism, they have guys who will come out and shoot you and then blend back into the community. You need a different set of strategies to fight them than you do to fight another comparable military. And our country, our military, had a long adjustment period of trying to figure out how do we fight a war against this relatively less powerful force in Afghanistan than we did during World War II in these massive other countries. Well, it's something similar like that we have to change our strategy to be prepared to fight against seductive attacks on our minds, subtle ideas that we're confronted with. Now, one of the problems with this is that we can't all go out and get PhDs in all the world philosophies that are out there. In fact, this morning, I probably used some words that if I said, explain to me what postmodernism is, a lot of us wouldn't be really well prepared for that conversation, right? So how do I'm a simple Christian. I just want to do what's right by God. I want to live this life and be faithful to him, but I don't necessarily know all of the attending ideas and philosophies behind, Marxism or whatever. So this morning I just want to look at 4 really simple strategies that we can use to prepare ourselves to not be taken captive. That we can use these 4 strategies to help evaluate, is this influencing me towards God? Is this influencing me away from God? They're pretty straightforward. The first one we've mostly already talked about, but it's this. Pick a side. You cannot play the middle. If you try to play the middle, you're on the opposite team from Jesus. Look, this is really important because a lot of Christians, they want to be peacemakers. They want to get along to go along. We just want to try to be, and that's a biblical value. The Bible teaches that we should live at peace with all men as much as it is up to us. But we are not allowed to live at peace to the detriment of this idea of whose team we're on, Team Jesus. This is actually a really powerful tool for you to use as you evaluate the world. Look, before I hear any argument, before I hear any data, before I hear any study, I'm on Team Jesus. I'm with whatever Jesus says. And it really requires that kind of pick a side. I'm with God. So if you show me the study about how homosexuality causes people to flourish and live their best life, whatever, I'm on Team Jesus. I'm on Team Jesus. And it helps to filter out a lot of this kind of like, I want to kind of be in the middle. I want to just take this neutral standpoint. No. You are either for him or you're against him. The Bible says that a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. You will find yourself, if you don't pick a side, you are going to find yourself slowly but surely being led astray and away from the simplicity of the gospel. So one of the most important things you do is pick a side. The second thing is this: judge everything by the light of Christ. Judge everything by the light of Christ. Every thought, every word of advice you get, every value you grew up with, every movie you watch or song you rock out to in your car. Here's what the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10:5. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Paul says, I'm an idea hammer. And I bring this hammer everywhere I go, and every time I'm presented with anything, every time I'm presented with a concept, a philosophy, an idea, a worldview, I take the hammer to it. And I just say, is this pro-Christ or anti-Christ? And I destroy and tear down everything that tries to raise itself up against the reality of Jesus. And then I take every experience I have and every thought that comes to my mind, and I compare it under the microscope, under the light of the gospel. Is this true? Is this godly? What is the message here? I'll invite the band up here. I think about how many things in our society, if we did this, we would be much better off. There's a movie that doesn't get brought up a whole lot anymore, but it used to come up all the time. If you ask any woman between like the ages of like 30 and 50 and say like, what's your favorite romance movie? Many of them will say The Notebook, okay? The Notebook is held up as this love story that is just so beautiful, and like that's what I'm after. And if you take that movie and you just examine it in the light of Christ, you bring it under the microscope of Jesus and you say, is this good? Is this beautiful? Is this true? Is this godly? What you find is this disaster of a movie that is pagan to the core, that elevates a disgusting view of the world, that you can sacrifice on the altar of your emotions and feelings everything that is good and virtuous and commendable. And I have seen many, many, many people, particularly women, ruin and destroy their lives because this is what they were after. This is what they were looking for. And what it requires of us is to say, wait. Look, let me turn off the soundtrack. Let me take away what is the core idea here. What is this looking at? And let me compare it to what the Bible says is good and true and beautiful. Does it stand up? I have an example for the guys, but I'm not going to get into it. I don't have time for it. Sorry. So pick a side. Judge everything by the light of Christ. The third thing is this. Consider the fruit. What is the fruit? Is this influence in your life producing a greater love for God or a greater love for the world? Are you growing in respect to godliness, faithfulness? Is your appetite for spiritual things increasing? Or does this draw your mind towards fleshly desires, fear, hopelessness? You know, during this last season in our country, I've talked to a lot of Christians who have said, I just had to fast from social media. I had to stop watching the news because I just found my heart and my mind so filled with fear and anxiety. I want to commend those people. We need to do that regularly. We need to evaluate, what is the fruit of this thing I'm experiencing? Just how does this make me feel? Is this causing me to hunger and long for God in a deeper, more meaningful way? Or is it causing me to like put my view on myself, my problems? I'm not saying that we should completely ignore, bad news and just be idealistic. But we've been confronted with a lot of bad news, but if you're confronted with that bad news and your heart is not driven towards God and faith in Him, then you need to evaluate what am I being influenced by? What am I being influenced by? What's the fruit? And the final thing is this. Evaluate who is influencing you. Who do you spend the most time with? Are they helping you to grow closer to God? Or do your friendships distract you and pull you away from God? Remember, you're going to be influenced. The only question you can really control is who are you going to be influenced by? The Bible says, don't be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. Are the people you spend the most time with, the people you listen to the most, are they people that are helping you grow in respect to godliness? Are they people that are, man, you guys just get together, you guys have a lot of fun, you guys know each other, you guys have all the same stories, you guys have a lot of experiences together, but you're not growing in respect to godliness and faith in Him? Look what Paul says in Philippians 3:17. Brethren, join in following my example and observe those who walk according to the pattern that you have in us. He says, look at me, follow me. I just want to ask you, do you have someone that you are trying to pattern your life after? Do you have an example of spiritual godliness, someone that you look up to that you're saying, I respect them and I admire them and I'm trying to become like them. I'm trying to follow the pattern that they are following. For a long time in my life, I didn't have anybody like that. There was a long time in my life when I was trying to be a Christian, I was trying to be godly, and I just kept failing, I kept doing it. And I got to the point where I despaired, and I just thought, I can't do it, it's not me. because I didn't have anybody I was trying to pattern myself after. Once I met men who were godly men who I could look at and say, these guys are guys I look up to. They're actually trying to follow Jesus. And I can do some of the things that they're doing. I can make some of the choices and act the way that they are. And I began to grow close to those and see the way that they parented their children, see the way that they loved their wives, see the way they conducted themselves, see how they acted in hard spots. And I thought, I want to follow after that pattern. So when I ask that question, are there some names that automatically come to your mind? You say, that's who I'm trying to emulate. Now, if you don't know them, you're not close to them, this is not something you can do from a long ways away. If we're not friends and you don't have my phone number and I don't have your phone number and we don't talk with some regularity, it's not me and you. These are people that you have to have a relationship with. You have to know and see really in their real life, what are they like? That will go a long way to saying, I want to gain godly influences in my life. I want to have someone who's a pattern that I can follow. If we do those 4 simple things, you will be well on your way to avoiding being taken captive and to be being sure that you are being influenced towards and for the Lord Jesus Christ. Would you stand to your feet? We're gonna close in worship.